it is now time for our panel forum. Just checking. The topic of this forum is, do we need an ASEAN Court of Human Rights? I would now like to introduce our panel members very briefly and invite them to the stage. Our moderator, Sharizan Johan. Our panelists, Mr. Edmund Bond and Mr. Faisal Moidin.
Okay, we have a very good forum today, a very good title. Do we need an ASEAN Court of Human Rights? Now, we have about half an hour to do this, and I think let's not make it so formal, okay? Let's not make it so uptight. Let's a bit more relaxed. How we'll do this is we won't let them, have their 15, 30 minutes spiel on the topic, okay? What we'll do is I will take charge and I will ask the questions, and then if I think their answers are not satisfactory, I will then say, no, the answer is not satisfactory, please give a proper answer. And I can stop them, so I have that power. I think LexisNexis has given me that power, right? Okay, so first of all, before that, if you're here and we're going to dispense with the basics, okay? If you don't know what human rights is, I don't know what you're doing here, okay? That's one. Number two, if you don't know anything about what we're talking about, later maybe just take down note and Google it, okay? We are just going to straight into the topic, okay? Before we go into this ASEAN Court of Human Rights, before we go into this, the first thing I think I want to ask panel members is it really possible to have a universal standard for human rights? Okay, I think we'll start with Edmund first. Is it possible to have a universal standard of human rights?
Yeah, I think thanks for organizing this LexisNexis. It appears that you all have a lot of money to organize this type of thing at Le Meridian. I think you should give some of us some of that money. I think forums and debates are important, but I think we always need to go a step further. But I think it's a good conversation point. I just want to preface it a little bit, if I'm allowed to.
Not too long.
That this question of regional mechanisms actually been discussed within the civil societies and NGOs. And I was just looking at my notes dated 2007. We have actually made presentations. We have analyzed all the regional mechanisms all over the world. So there is the Inter-Americas regional mechanism. There's of course the European one. There's also the Arab mechanism. And the question is, because ASEAN is so big, how do we do that? When you talk about universal standards of human rights, I think we all know the UDHR. I think there's always a misconception, and sometimes Mac, I see on Twitter, use some words, linguistic play of words, to actually say that cultural differences actually will not allow that universal standard for human rights. I think that's a misconception, because we are not talking about, to make it very simple, everybody has a BMW. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about everybody having a bungalow. Universal standards of human rights is actually very basic. Basic as to your food, shelter, house, and your basic necessities. So we have done workshops all over the world. Not all over the world, sorry. The same workshops have been done all over, but not by us, like my Consti and Undi Malaysia. And this workshop basically is this. You ask anyone in the group, what are the 5 things you want to take to a new earth? Assuming this country is going to be destroyed, assuming we get invaded by more Suluans, from Sabah, and they come down to Semenanjung, and we can't stop them.
Kiramis, because
okay.
Yes, Malaysian.
So you don't know enough about Sabah. So you ask anybody, what are the 5 things you want to take? So people will say food, house, family, love, relationship, religion, everything. Very basic. You ask the same 5 questions to people or participants in Europe with the same workshop module, they'll say basically the same things. You ask the same 5 participants in Saudi Arabia, they say the 5 same things. You ask a person in Brazil, they'll say the same 5 things. So we're talking about that basic. And that basic, I think now is acknowledged all over the world, if you are a member of United Nations.
But Eamon, okay, sorry.
Within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
I need to butt in. Okay, the question is now, you say that, okay, everyone, you can have a universal standard. Okay, but looking at the articles themselves, okay, people have, I'm sure Mac will also say that, there are certain things where it's not compatible with certain cultures and all that. But I like to take it a bit further than that. For example, Article 21, okay, says that, you have the right, basically you have the right to vote, or rather, every person would have the right to determine their own government and all that. Now, this supposes that only in a democracy can human rights be protected. Surely this cannot be correct, because if I have a kingdom and I protect human rights the way it's supposed to be protected and all that, does that mean that I'm not living up to the standards of human rights?
So I think the question is the right to vote. Within the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, we say that everybody has the right to vote because this is important so that we don't have dictators rule. So as simple as that. So even if the dictator, for example, ensures that everybody is happy in that state, right, which I think is virtually impossible, we say that the basic is that everybody must be allowed to choose their government.
So only in a democracy can human rights be protected?
That's not what I'm saying. We are saying that it's a right to vote, and that right to vote is a human right. That's all.
Okay, Mac, so, you're right with me calling you Mac,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay, so we've heard from Edmund. Edmund says that, yeah, we can have a standard, but I'm quite sure that you have a different view. Can you please share your view?
The presumption correctly made. I have a different view, not to say that we cannot all aspire to have certain basic standards of human rights, but we have to come to a point where we need to answer the important questions. Because just sweeping this question under the carpet is not going to help promote or develop human rights in a way that is beneficial for everyone. There is still the question of cultural differences. There is still question of religious differences. Now, we cannot say that the cultural and religious differences are things that which is in light of the, say for example, UDHR, is something that we can simply ignore. And in fact, in some society, people don't want you to ignore that. Now, therefore, the most important thing is to recognize these differences and see how promotion of human rights takes into account these principles. Now, if we fail to take into account these principles, then there will always be a question of us against them. And that is not helping anyone, and that is not helping promote human rights in any form or shape whatsoever.
Okay. So you say that there can be a universal a standard for human rights, but we need to have more discussions, or rather to try and find that common standard.
No, I think we need to find balance between conflicting values. That's the most important thing. I think Edmund also misread my tweet, Edmund. The point is not the point is not so much about saying that we cannot aspire to have an equal standard for everyone. The question is, how do we get there? Now, in getting there, that is the importance of recognizing that we are all different, because ultimately, if you promote human rights, you need to realize that intrinsically, human beings are all different. So having said that and trying to promote and value these differences, we are not prescribing an equal standard, one size fit all for all of us. That is also sort of a contradiction in terms. Now, how do we get around it? I have no answer for you folks here in this hall. But how do we get around it? At the very least, we must always recognize the existence of other values. Now, once we recognize the existence of other values, we cannot simply say, in any event we take precedent, or the right under UDHR takes precedent. We have to find a way to balance out the values, for example, cultural differences or religious values, in a way that is palatable to the society as a whole. And that is very important.
Okay, do you think that, okay, that's talking about universal, that's talking about the world. Let's focus on ASEAN. Do you think that at least amongst the Asian countries, ASEAN countries, we can have a universal standard of human rights? Is there enough commonalities, enough similarities between the different cultures and whatnot to actually have one human rights standard for ASEAN?
The short answer to that would be no, because if you look at Vietnam, Vietnam is a communist state. Now, that being the case, obviously the standard that they aspire to or the standard that they practice in their country is different. Now, having said that we can't have a common human rights at this point doesn't mean that we don't need to, or doesn't mean that we don't want to. But we have to look at this issue in two ways. The first is, can it happen? Now that's the reality on the ground. There's no point for us to talk about human rights, to talk about the universality of it without taking into account the state that ASEAN is in today. You look at ASEAN today, then the first question that comes to mind is it possible? Now, the second question that we should be asking ourselves would be, considering that the state that ASEAN is in today, again, should it be made possible, for example, to have a regional mechanism? So these things need to be addressed. We cannot just say because we have a document, therefore everybody must arrive at that in a similar way or in a similar fashion.
Do you think the ASEAN Declaration of Human Rights is that standard?
Sorry, what standard?
The human rights so-called standard of ASEAN. Do you think that can
Well,
be
the bigger
standard?
question is, what is the real human rights standards that we aspire? We can always say that question of rights and freedom always evolve based on the society. But no, the ASEAN Declaration for Human Rights, we cannot say that it is up to, let's say, the par of UDHR. But at the same time, we cannot just simply dismiss it as something that is worthless altogether. Because for every region, and we have seen, for example, even in Europe and America, the development of rights there are organic, meaning it takes time to develop, and as it develops, it comes up with new aspirational values. Now, the willingness of ASEAN state to first come up with this declaration in the first place, considering the ASEAN way, which is the foundation of ASEAN itself, is commendable, because we have taken the first step to actually come up with an aspirational document, which, let's not forget, and as Chiwi mentioned in his preamble, says is for the purposes of promoting rights.
Edmund, so do we need an ASEAN Court of Human Rights?
Yeah, I think we do. I think Mac, to answer Mac, actually, I accept a lot of what you say about cultural and religious differences, and we've said that within the instruments itself, there is allowance for those things. So for judges who are well read, especially from the English jurisprudence, we know this thing that the European Court of Human Rights calls the margin of appreciation. So for freedom of expression, freedom of religion, there's always a margin of appreciation that is vested with different governments for them to allow slight differences in interpretations based on their culture and religion. So actually that is allowed, and we don't object to that. But Mac is looking at it in terms of cultural and religious differences, sort of excluding or diluting basic standards. Because I don't want to use the word universal. When you use universal, then it's very easy to say, oh, everybody must be treated the same. We're talking about basic standard minimums. So margin appreciation allows for that, and judges have said it in Times, Handyside, and all those cases. The second thing is, instead of excluding, using cultural and religious values to exclude universal basic standards, minimum standards, cultural and religious values are used in especially Africa and in Arab Charter to actually enrich human rights. Meaning you have that basic minimum, but you enrich human rights by giving that interpretation that will allow for differences in those communities. But so all those instruments actually allow for that. So like community building, allowing to make sure that you respect the community rather than just the individual. That's all allowed in all the different charters.
But you're going into the meat of it. But just to answer the question, why you say that yes you need, but why is it that we need an ASEAN Court of Human Rights?
Okay, I don't have time, but I have a long PowerPoint. Basically, these different regional mechanisms have found, and based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came about because of the Nazi atrocities in 1945, discrimination, and all that kind of thing. It came about because we realized that certain national courts and a lot of the courts are unable or unwilling to act to deal with violations of human rights. So before you're allowed to go to that regional court, like the Inter-America or even Europe, there's very stringent filter provisions that allow you to then file a claim, for example, in the European Court of Human Rights. And one of the stringent requirements is that the highest court, the apex court in that state, has been shown to be unable or unwilling to act. Therefore, you need that supranatural court in those very limited circumstances. So for example, I give a very simple example. We talk about the Rohingyas problem, right? The Rohingyas in Burma. We've gone in and done capacity building. Who is going to help them? Nobody. I've gone to Burma and it's just crazy. You talk about Rohingyas, you talk about Muslims, the discrimination is extreme. You say, oh, you're from Malaysia, are you Muslim? Oh, you know, really is really bad for the Rohingyas. That's why then you see the Rohingyas running away from Burma. Who's going to help them? The courts are not going to act. Government is not going to act. The NLD leader doesn't want to say anything. So, where do they run to? Of course, Myanmar's courts, we had discussions at AG and all, the courts are not functioning. The constitutional courts, the judges have been sacked actually. And so they have not even put them in. But even assuming it's functioning, they can't go anywhere. And therefore, that criteria where the courts are unable or unwilling to act to stop the discrimination against Rohingyas will have to find its place within a more regional court where you have judges coming from all states of ASEAN. And that's why it is so important, because it protects these oppressed, the minorities, and especially those people who within the states are, we can see, are persecuted.
But how do you enforce? Say, for example, these Rohingyans bring it to this ACHR, they get the decision their way, they come back to their states, and then they can't enforce it. No. So how are you going to make sure that there's enforcement?
Okay, in Europe, there's a protocol. You sign up to the protocol. Once you sign up to the court, the states respect the decisions of the courts. So the courts are binding. And therefore, for example, in England, you have now the Human Rights Act to actually make it even more, make it even stronger for enforcement. That is the role of the court. Of course, we're talking about commissions before that. So commissions has an advisory role. So Africa, for example, they've gone, when the Nigerians were attacked by their government, they've made other states in Africa were complaining about Nigeria to the commission. Then the commission will say, these are the facts, this is the problem. I make a communication and say, hey, Nigerian government, can you stop doing this? But that is not binding. So that is the enforcement weakness of a commission, where people are talking about ASEAN Human Rights Commission. When you talk about court, everybody who signs up, and there's a protocol to sign up, you actually sign up to being bound by a decision of the court.
Okay, hold on to that thought. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Okay, Mac, do we need a ASEAN Court of Human Rights?
Now, this answer of mine should not be equated to say that people in ASEAN does not deserve human rights. But no, we do not need an ASEAN Court of Human Rights. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is very simple. First, again, we have to live in a real world, and we have to look at the practicalities and the reality of international law. For example, I take the example that Edmund used earlier about Myanmar. Assuming even we have ASEAN Court of Human Rights, which the moderator rightly pointed out, how do you enforce? But the first question would be, if Myanmar does not want to sign up to the treaty, then there is nothing much we could do about it, and we are back to square one. Now, the reason, and that is the reason why I'm saying we don't need an ASEAN Human Rights Court, because one, we have to look at the realities of it. What is it actually, or how is it actually that we can enforce human rights in a better way? The second issue is this. Just because the European have it, just because the Americas have it, just because the African have it, doesn't necessarily mean we need to follow the same route. European Court, when they started fantastic because the member at that point in time was mostly the Western European states. And when declaration was issued by the European Court, immediately state laws were also changed to reflect that new point. Now, the problem is, as the Eastern European countries join, we have problems of states not respecting and challenging the power of the European Court. And at the same time, the European Court has no power to enforce it. So then it becomes back to square one. There can be a court, but then it's just a paper judgment. Nothing gets changed at the national level. Because ultimately, we have to realize the problem really is the member state. So how do you affect changes at the national level before we even talk about supranational level? If the rule of law is entrenched at the national level, then whatever decision is made at the supranational level will automatically get reflected at the national level. But if the rule of law is missing from the national level, then no matter what edict is issued at the supranational level, it wouldn't make a difference.
So what do you think would be the mechanism to, for example, taking the Rohingya example, if we don't have a court of human rights, what would be the mechanism that would be effective to assist the Rohingyans in that situation?
Again, I don't profess to have all the answers, I'll be frank. But the thing is, we can look at the example of Myanmar itself in seeing that whether in a long run a problem can be solved organically. Myanmar has been shut to the world all this while. But through the pressure from the international community and also via engagement by ASEAN, we have seen them now opening up. It may not be fast enough, it may not be the way we want it, but we are seeing change. Now, this may be one way that we can continue to try and enforce and bring human rights and rule of law at the national level within a state. But I don't see how necessarily having a supranational body dictating terms to them will necessarily be happily received by the Myanmar junta.
Okay, Edmund, coming back to your point, you say that we need a court of human rights, which is to ensure that you don't have human rights violations are remedied. Yeah. My question then is, what about the issue of sovereignty of the member states' courts? Okay, because, for example, our own constitution, Article 121 has been amended to actually take away the judicial power of the federation from the courts. Now, what you're doing now, or rather, if you have a mechanism similar to the ASEAN Court of Human Rights, you are going to have a situation where there's another judicial body having power to enforce decisions in Malaysia. So how do you come around to that? How do you square that with?
Since the moderator mentioned 121, and I see some judges here, I think it's quite important to look at 121 again. And I think there were some cases, especially in land acquisition matters, and I think there's one or two cases which are still being discussed as to whether the amendment to 121 was unconstitutional, because you cannot remove a basic structure of the constitution. I think that amendment, I think the federal court has recently also recognized the basic structure doctrine. So that amendment
which
to
case,
us...
Tell which case? Huh? What case that?
Sirasa Rasia.
Yeah, so that everyone can read it up.
Yeah, read it up, okay. So, so I want to set that aside, because personally I think the ouster is unconstitutional. We have removed the automatic judicial power, and it's a removal of one of the basic features of the constitution, which was put in place in 1957. Okay, but apart from that question, the question was whether, as sovereign states, why should we cede power to a supernatural body, right? It goes back to the need. ASEAN, I think, has developed in such a way that all our state governments, all our different countries' governments have found an economic need to actually come together. Really, it's not because of human rights. These human rights for the ASEAN states is just window dressing. But as human rights activists, we take the hypocrisy. When governments want to be hypocrites, we take and hold them to it. So when people sign, for example, integrity pledges, we make sure that we hold them to it. That's an example. So when we say we want to have a progressive, caring, liberal ASEAN regional mechanism, right, within the ASEAN Charter, there's so many different pillars. One of these pillars must be that all these issues that affect us affect all of us together. That's why Europe came together. That's why Africa came together. That's why even the Arab states have a charter, because they have so many similar commonalities. And I go back to the Rohingyans problem. The Rohingyan problem in Malaysia, we see, really is not our problem. Of course, we have issues about refugee status. Some people say don't give them refugee. But why have they come here? The simple reason is because our neighbor is persecuting them. So, if we do not help Myanmar deal with that problem, or help the Rohingyas deal with that problem, we will face the problem. And therefore, we realize that we are not, these state borders were actually part of the colonial, now you talk about Sulu, we all read a bit more, we know, right? Yeah lah, I colonize you, I give you this for 5,000 ringgit. These state borders are really artificial. Whether you are Malaysian or Singaporean, we are, human lah. But, we just draw the map so that, people can sell maps and say, oh, I've gone to this different country, and it's really nice. But I think this some of these state borders are quite porous and illusory. Because we wanted some sort of control over our own land. But never mind, that apart, that historical precedent, that apart, we have now developed that all of us in the ASEAN region wants to become more caring, more liberal, more progressive. And so because of that, we need to have all of us coming together and saying, hey, your problem is also my problem. And if your problem is my problem, and two of us, instead of going to war, will submit our claims to, for example, supernatural court, which have all your representatives, like what happens in Europe, then so be it.
So you are saying that because we have this need, so it's okay to cede a bit of our sovereignty, judicial sovereignty.
There is no question about sovereignty when it comes to killing people, persecuting people. When you kill Rohingyans and you persecute Rohingyans, there's no question saying, hey, Myanmar will say, Malaysia, please don't disturb me because it's all right for me to kill them because it's in my state. As logical as that. So the Philippines said, never mind, you go and kill these Suluans. Right?
Kirams.
Of course, my language not very good. Of course, you know, we have a right to self-defense, and I don't know why, you know, that right has not been invoked. Because we have a total right to self-defense. They have come in, they've invaded. Of course, they're making a claim. But again, this whole issue, we are so interconnected, we should not be holding on to some of these artificial borders and start to realize that the ASEAN region actually is one big state. Europe is now one big state. Of course, people are complaining about it. Africa is one big state. And whatever happens to us will affect others.
Mac wants to say something.
I think on that count, I completely agree with Edmund. I think the bigger question here is this. Yeah, probably the first time. But the bigger question is this: how do we effect a meaningful change given the impediments that we have with the structure of international law and international mechanism? Now, it's fine and dandy to say having an ASEAN Human Rights Court will solve all the problem of Rohingya. Suddenly they find themselves clothed, a roof over their head, and they have food on the table. It's fine to say that, but the reality is it will only happen if the government of Myanmar decides to join the ASEAN Human Rights Court framework. Is this going to happen? Now, let's be realistic about it. It is not going to happen. At least at this stage, right now, it is not going to happen. So how then, or what then is the solution for us to help the Myanmaris? Other than, of course, taking them into their border as refugees, which is also part of the state obligation within the international context, the other thing that we can do is to continue to engage the Myanmarese government so that change can happen organically. And that's very important, because it's again interesting to talk about the European courts. Which is a laudable move, which they have been doing fantastic all this while. But at the rate of them dispensing decisions today, it will take 46 years for them to clear their backlog, which amounts to about 150,000 cases, at a rate of 1,500 cases per year. Now, again, if we put that context into perspective in places such as ASEAN, where we see far more violation of human rights, then the question becomes, when will the effect or meaningful change will be dispensed to the people of ASEAN? So it's really not about having a structure, therefore we can deem to have the rights that come along with the structure that seeks to protect it. It's really about effecting a meaningful change. So where do we find that meaningful change? Is the ASEAN Court of Human Rights the answer? I don't think so.
What about the suggested or the commission that they want to set up, where I think it's more of an advisory role as opposed to a judicial role? Do you think that would be effective?
I think that would be a very good first step, because the thing is, again, we have to look at the evolution of ASEAN. ASEAN wasn't created for the purposes of protecting human rights. And this part I disagree with Edmund. It's not about window dressing, because initially ASEAN was created as a body to protect security and to promote prosperity within the region. The region is very poor in itself. Of course, most of the country, especially the original 5 members, have developed substantially, but given the region's situation is quite poor. And the main concern for which these 5 states originally came about was for the protection of security and for the promotion of prosperity. But then it has evolved. So again, the question is, it may not be at the pace that we like, but there is an evolution, and we are seeing an evolution. From a body which is not concerned about rights, today it has passed a declaration, maybe not up to our standard, but today it has passed an aspirational document to say this is where we want to head. Now, what we need to do is to help ASEAN to show them how best we can do it, not to impose ideas which have been carried out in other regions and say because it worked in that region, it must necessarily work for your region too. Now, the body that is created under ASEAN is proof or testament to that evolution of ASEAN as a regional body. Now, there is this bigger debate whether regionalism is something that we need to, or the way forward for the world. But I'm not going to get into that issue. But focusing solely on the question of human rights, ASEAN Court of Human Rights, and the reality on the ground in ASEAN, I think evolution in terms of right and in terms of mechanism that is created will happen, but it will happen slowly and progressively. And I think sometimes we have to bear with that if we want to see a meaningful change.
Okay, I've been told to wrap up. So last question or set of questions to Edmund. We've talked about the commission. Okay, say maybe if we take the position that perhaps now realistically we can't have a court of human rights. What we have now is this declaration. What we have now is the suggestion of having this commission. The problem is you activists say that, say that, you know, this is not enough and all that, you know, you bleeding heart. Yeah. So it's not enough. But don't you think this is a good first step? At least they are doing something. Don't you think so?
Yeah, of course. That's why I don't see why Mac is saying, you know, it cannot be done. Because if you think about it, even during that time, 98, during the Reformasi time, nobody thought there would be a SWACAM. And SWACAM has done so much. Nobody that time thought that we have an ASEAN human rights mechanism. And now we have that. Of course, to me, it's a very good step, but we always aspire to more. And I think that's our job. Because if we don't, then we will always be happy with whatever we have and compare ourselves to Zimbabwe. But before I finish, can I just give some figures? Because Shah tells me there are a lot of students here. These figures were 2007. In Europe, there are 800 million people. European Convention, 1950. Americas, 900 million people. American Declaration on Rights and Duties of Men and the Convention. Africa, 800 million people. The question at that time in 2007 was how do we set up a mechanism for Asia? Asia had about 4 billion people. Now we have decided, I think, to set up an ASEAN mechanism for a smaller region, and I think that will actually help us with the smaller population be able to implement. Yeah. So I want to summarize by making the 5 arguments, although I've not been saying it very well. The rationale, I think, is the first, that it strengthens the culture and promotion of human rights. So it's the better than not argument. It's better to have it than not have it. So if you don't have it, it doesn't strengthen, but if you have it, I think it strengthens more than less.
This you're talking about the Court of Human Rights?
Yeah, and the mechanism that will include the court and commission, because Africa has both, and Europe has both. The second argument is it's so small, man. Safety net protection argument. This was the things that we were doing that time. Safety net protection argument, where states are unwilling or unable to act on the violations, so you need that body to be a safety net for the people of ASEAN. The third reason is that it gives interstate pressure. So the name and shame argument. So why are you doing that in Myanmar? You know, you shouldn't be doing that. And then if you're doing that to us, there's a sort of a check and balance. The fourth argument is that the UN mechanism is too slow and cumbersome. Yasmin is now been appointed to the CRC committee. So for example, if you sign up to the CRC, you can actually complain and make communications to the committee. The problem is that the UN system is just too cumbersome. It's too far away in Geneva. Nobody knows how to use it except the NGOs. So the court actually provides an avenue. And the fifth argument, of course, is that because of the different cultural differences, because of the difference in religious values, it actually to us informs human rights jurisprudence through different experiences and cultures. So as I said, it will inform and improve our own system based on our interpretation, as opposed to using religious and cultural values to actually set aside basic minimum standards. And that will then create a groundswell for greater education and greater awareness of human rights within the region.
Okay, I'm just going to let Mac respond if he thinks that he wants to respond.
No, I mean, not really specifically a response. I agree with what Edmund said. These are principles which we know of and which we aspire to achieve, but I think the bigger question is how do we go about it? Now, in deciding how do we go about it, we have to look at the realities on the ground. Theory and practice is completely different, and I think today is one of the examples where we see the differences, because when we are talking about international law, again, it boils down to the question of willingness by state governments. But that brings to the point of what we can do instead, and I think having national bodies, for example, like Malaysia, we have Suhakam, for example, is a great starting point to entrench rule of law at the national state, because ASEAN is only as strong in terms of human rights when it comes to how strong the member states are. So if we can push the national level, at the national level, to have a more entrenched rule of law, this will necessarily translate to a stronger ASEAN in terms of human rights. And things that people like Edmund Bond, I'm not labeling here, but people like Edmund Bond does, is very important because they lobby and they help promote at the national level. Now, of course, Edmund has now gone international, but the work he does at the national level also is very important, because then it starts to entrench the rule of law at the national level. And when it does that, automatically it translates to more willingness on the part of government to be a part or member of an international mechanism or a regional mechanism. And I think we need to recognize that before we approach this issue.
Okay, thank you. We have to wrap up. I'm so sorry. We only have 30 minutes, actually. I think we've gone past that. There's still so many things to discuss. Maybe next time we'll have a forum where we'll have a bit longer, 1 hour or something like that. And I just want to say that these seats are far too comfortable. That's why you see me going like that, and not knowing how to actually sit properly in this. So I'm just going to hand it back to Gayatri. Thank you so much to Edmund. Thank you so much to Mac. I think we've had a very fruitful discussion, but we'll have a longer discussion, hopefully. LexisNexis, please organize something.